Welcome to the WTR Biotech Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's podcast episode, I'm being joined by Jennifer Good, CEO of Trevi Therapeutics, NASDAQ ticker symbol TRVI, which is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company developing an oral therapy for chronic cough associated with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF, a serious lung disease, as well as for patients with refractory chronic cough. Also joining us is my WTR Equity Research colleague, Do Kim. Good morning, and thank you both for joining today's podcast.
Good
Thanks,
morning.
Tim.
Jennifer, to kick things off, would you please tell our listeners about your background and what led you to start Trevi Therapeutics and your clinical drug, Haduvio?
Yeah, happy to do that. I grew up in this business actually on the finance side of the world. So started out, I was a chief financial officer for a number of years, eventually made my way to CEO, which I was doing the math the other day. I've been a biotech CEO now for 20 years, which is frightening. It's like dog years in this business. So what led me to start, I co-founded this company with a neurologist, Dr. Thomas Shasha. Tom and I had previously worked together at a company called Penn West Pharmaceuticals, where we were doing pain drug development. And we'll talk more about the mechanism of the drug. But while we were working in pain, we recognized sort of the obvious opioid crisis, which was starting to brew. And it started working on nalbuphine there to put it into a nice twice-day oral because the drug was not scheduled. And we'll get more into that. That company was ultimately acquired when our lead indication got approved by the FDA. And that happened in 2010. When that transaction closed, Tom and I were still interested in this drug. And so I went back down and Tom and I bought it out and started the company at our kitchen table, as they say. So we've been on sort of a 10+ year journey to get to this point, but it's been a lot of fun and rewarding.
That's a really cool story. So Jennifer, I'm now going to turn it over to Do Kim to ask a few questions, and I'll come back full circle in a little while.
Okay.
Thanks, Tim. Welcome, Jennifer, and congrats again. I've offered this before, but on the success of Haduvio in your recent clinical trials in chronic cough. Before we get to the positive phase 2 data sets, could we first talk about the biology of how Haduvio works and how that affects the systemic mediators of chronic cough? I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, it's the foundational question here, and really was the whole basis Tom and I started the company on. So the drug is broadly in the opioid category, but importantly, when you think about opioids, people sort of get scared of them. This drug has been unscheduled for decades. And the reason fundamentally is the drugs that are abused today, things like morphine, fentanyl, they're all mu agonists. So all their activity comes at the mu receptor. There are other opioid receptors, however, and our drug actually agonizes at kappa. So the activity comes through kappa. There'd been some early animal work that showed kappa was extremely potent in cough. That became interesting. There's sort of a second side of our mechanism, which actually blocks the mu receptor. It's a mu antagonist. And so that's what's kept it unscheduled all these years. It's blocking mu and agonizing kappa. So that was fundamentally important to just the underlying mechanism. I think to the question you were asking, why cough and why in the biology is it important? What's interesting about our drug is it works, the lung is filled with opioid receptors. So the drug not only works peripherally in the lung where there's triggers of cough that are coming, it's also the spinal cord, which is the signaling, obviously, pathway, is rich in opioid receptors. And then importantly, the brainstem is rich in opioid receptors. And that's where I think Haduvio differentiates itself. People have been trying to treat cough by only looking at peripheral pathways. Our drug works centrally in the brainstem, which mediates coughing and breathing. So what you'll see when we talk about our data is it's got a big effect in almost everyone and works almost immediate. And we think it's because it's got this central and peripheral mechanism that it's working through.
Great, great. And you said that the drug is unscheduled by the DEA, and we know that the active ingredient is an approved pain medication already out there. But does this affect the clinical development and the regulatory requirements, knowing that it is an opioid drug? How does that determine how you put forth your clinical path?
Yeah, it's a great question. So The product that's out available on the market today is a sub-Q injection, 2-hour half-life. It's only used in acute settings in a hospital. So there'd be sort of no way to use that in chronic cough. You know, that's something that has to be dosed regularly and you need systemic blood levels. I think as far as your regulatory question, because this drug is known, it's a 505(b)(2) pathway. So a lot of the tox work, genotox, CARC studies had all been done. So making it more efficient to sort of get to be able to get into the clinic. So that's helpful. But the reality is we are going from an acute label to a chronic dosing in sort of very different patient groups. So, you know, in a lot of ways, it's almost an NCE. I think to your opioid question, fortunately, most of the abuse liability work had all been done. There's sort of what's called this 8-factor plan you have to do for scheduling. And 6 or 7 of the factors were done. So we had to update it to bring it to current day standards. We had to run a human abuse potential study, which just became required in 2017. That data reaffirmed its unscheduled profile. And then when we file our drug, we'll actually submit the entire clinical database so that they can look through the AEs that occurred during our program. And hopefully it's supportive of continuing for the drug unscheduled.
Right. And the human abuse potential study that you conducted was in line with your expectations, and you don't expect any changes to this scheduling.
No, and just to frame it, because obviously investors are paid to sort of worry about this. When you, again, back to the morphine fentanyl story, those are all Schedule II drugs. There's no world this ever ends up in that bucket. Those are all highly abusable mu agonists. The FDA asked us to compare to what's called a Schedule IV drug, which are things, the definition of Schedule IV is low likelihood of abuse, low likelihood of addiction. So it's things like sleep aids, benzos actually fall in there, tramadol's in there, some of the codeine cough syrup. So we compared against that. We were statistically less likable. So it tells you we should be less scheduled than that. The only other schedule is Schedule V, which has virtually no restrictions. So the fact that the drug's been around for decades unscheduled, I think it likely stays unscheduled. If anything, maybe Schedule V, which is not a big deal here. But I just think it's important people understand, you know, it's not sort of Schedule II or nothing. There's a whole delineation in between that, which is where these drugs fit.
Right, right. And I've heard that physicians, given no real options out there, are pretty comfortable in providing these addictive opioids. So it would be great to have an unscheduled drug out there that could provide equivalent benefit. And just as a segue into that, let's talk about your most recent data in chronic cough or IPF. Could you provide some highlights on the efficacy data?
Yeah, happy to do that. So we had previously run a 2A crossover design in IPF cough. Data was super strong. So the trial you're referring to now is our phase 2B study in IPF cough. It was 160 patients, 4-arm study. So we looked at, it was a proper dose ranging study. We looked at 3 doses versus placebo. It was 6 weeks long, and this was an important study. There had never been a study trial that had been successful in IPF cough in phase 2B. So this was the furthest anybody had gotten to. There was not a lot known about what the placebo effect would look like. So it was, you know, important for the field overall. Our data ended up just as strong as we saw in the 2A. We had a 17% placebo effect, which sort of by standard trial standards is pretty low, actually. And I think it's because these patients truly have fibrosis and diseased lungs. So placebo's not going to likely work in this condition. And then across our different dose ranges, we had roughly a 48% drug effect in the low dose, 53% in the mid dose, and 60% in the high dose, which was a 43% placebo adjusted change. So really big effect. The first time we measured the endpoints for these studies is an objective cough monitor. So you're truly counting the number of coughs. The first time we measured it post sort of dosing was 2 weeks in, and the full effect was already there by 2 weeks. So, you know, seemed to come on very quickly, big drug effect. And then the responder analyses, we had 87% of patients responded at a clinically meaningful level. So, you know, worked in almost everyone. Again, back to the mechanism pathway we talked about, I think that's because you're hitting the lung and the brain. So that whole pathway is covered by the opioid receptors where this drug's active.
Yeah, that dose response, that consistent dose response offers a lot of confidence that you're seeing a real drug effect. And as you carry over into a phase 3, you do noticed some differences from the 2A study, the 2B study on the placebo rate, and especially on the discontinuation rate. I mean, the discontinuation rate for the 2B was extremely low. How do you carry assumptions into the phase 3 with the slight differences that you see? And is it because of the study designs? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the beauty of, I was more worried going from the 2A crossover design to the 2B. I think now from the 2B to the phase 3, the only thing that will change between those two studies is the length of time. It's the same primary endpoint. We'll take 2 of the doses forward in a parallel arm design. We had this study in 60 sites in 10 countries around the world, so we've already sort of dealt with variability and what that looks like. So we'll go from a 6-week study that this trial was to a 12-week study, and we don't anticipate a lot of changes over that time. As a matter of fact, I hope we'll continue to see bigger benefit, as people sort of are in longer and are able to settle down their cough.
Right. And you talked about your competitors and the rough times that they've had in their clinical trials. How do these results, besides being consistent, compared to the ones that are still carrying forward their therapies? And what about the therapies that actually go for the disease in IPF? Do they have an effect on cough?
Yeah, so good question. So fortunately for us, not for patients, but the competitive landscape here has really weeded itself out. The P2X3s were tried here, they failed, the drug working in refractory chronic cough. So there's basically 2 programs left. One of them's an NK1 antagonist at a small company. That drug actually failed on the objective cough monitor and missed statistical significance on the primary endpoint of a patient-reported outcome. They're sort of piecing together some data to try to see if there's a signal. So I think that drug's not likely to be able to progress forward. The other program we're keeping our eye on is Boehringer Ingelheim, who's one of the big innovators in the antifibrotics, which you asked about, recognizes the importance of cough to these patients. So they started a phase 2A trial. It's with a peripheral-only mechanism, a TRPA antagonist. That mechanism's actually failed twice in refractory chronic cough, so I was a little surprised to see it crop up here. But BI is obviously a good company. They've just recruited the first part of that study, and they're doing an interim analysis to see if they get a response. So we should see that data sometime later in the summer. So that's really the only other program we're sort of watching in the space. To your question on antifibrotics, there's 2 approved products, as you know, Ofev and Esbriet. Neither of them were able to show improvement on cough or any other QOL measures. They essentially slow disease progression, but they don't reverse it. So, instead of living sort of 3 to 5 years of this tough life, it just sort of extends it out and makes the progression slower. Also, BI just put out data at the American Thoracic Society on their new antifibrotic, where they also measured cough and did not show any improvement. So we see these as being dosed concurrently with the antifibrotics, where hopefully people live longer and with our drug have an overall better quality of life.
Yeah, we recently talked to a CEO about how important it is quality on life to these patients and physicians, and sometimes investors forget about how important patients' lives are while taking these medications.
Yeah, no, you're right. We had a KOL on our data call we did a week ago, and it's a pulmonologist who sees these patients, and someone had asked him about how quickly do you think the uptake of the drug would be? And he said, for every patient that's coughing, they should get this script day 1, because they have a limited amount of time. They have a 3 or 4 year lifespan. So every day you give away is just 1 day less where they can talk on the phone, go out for a walk, be around people, So it really put it in perspective that it keeps these patients isolated and pretty sedentary. So if you can lift that lid off, it really does change sort of what their last few years look like.
Right. And transitioning out of chronic cough in the world of lung disease, which makes sense that if you have fibrosis, it could lead to these kinds of coughs. But when you have coughs that are potentially productive, how do physicians look at these coughs and be able to determine whether it's just a productive cough that's persistent or lingers after illness? or that it becomes a refractory chronic cough, and that's not productive? And does that include this category of unexplained chronic cough?
Yeah, so all good questions. So basically, productive cough is anything that's a wet cough. So when you're clearing things out of your lungs, that's a cough we do not want to be involved in. Bronchiectasis, certain COPDs, post-viral cough, those kinds of things. You don't want to tamper that down because that's an important reflex that your body's doing to clear your lungs. There's some hallmarks of what's called neurogenic coughs. It's more of a feedback mechanism. The underlying disease goes away, but this neurogenic cough just continues on because what happens is, we have this protective threshold in our brain that if you smell fire, you'll cough when it sort of triggers that threshold. What happens when you cough so often neurologically, it resets that threshold lower so that barely anything will trip that trigger. They call it hypersensitization. So this urge to cough is constantly present, and it comes from exercising, talking on the phone, smells, changes in temperatures. It's just these are these constant triggers these people are living with. So it's also another hallmark is when you go to bed at night, these coughs largely stop because the brain activity settles down. So I think for pulmonologists, they recognize this. We've been able to get really clear guidance sort of on, what are the appropriate coughs for us to look at without interfering with, important biology. And you had a last part of your question, Doe, which I forgot.
Oh yeah, there is something that I saw where it's a subgroup called unexplained chronic cough,
Yeah.
where they can't find a relationship or an illness.
Yeah, so there's kind of two buckets. And I think I was just at the American Cough Conference, and I think the terms are sort of converging so that people don't get hung up on one or the other. Refractory chronic cough is when there's been an underlying disease that was the initial trigger, asthma, GERD, post-viral cough. The underlying disease gets treated or goes away, but this neurological cough is set in. That's refractory chronic cough. So the disease now is the cough.
Hmm.
Unexplained chronic cough is, idiopathic cough. They have no idea what triggered it, but for some reason, these people have been coughing for as long as they can remember. I mean, we had a guy in our latest trial in refractory chronic cough who's been coughing for 45 years. He couldn't even remember where it started. So, these are really, refractory chronic cough is terrible. Talk about destroying people's lives. So anyway, those are the difference, but they do kind of get merged into the same overall sort of neurogenic cough.
I mean, as a person who's gone through illnesses and have persistent cough that could last for weeks or months, I can't even imagine having something that lasts for years and how frustrating and debilitating that could possibly be.
And just to frame it, I mean, this guy coughed 2,000 times a day. We aren't talking about like a couple hundred coughs a day. I mean, people routinely in our studies are in the 1,000 to 2,000 range for coughing. So it's really severe cough, which, as you can imagine, is doing a lot of damage to your lungs, particularly for the people with lung disease.
That's amazing. And transitioning, of course, to your equally impressive results for the 2A study in refractory chronic cough. That was back in March. Could you talk about that data for us? I think it was a similar crossover design that you had for 2A and IPF.
Yeah, so I was just pulling it up again so I get the numbers correct here. The overall placebo-adjusted change, just with the back to the 2A crossover design, was 56% placebo-adjusted change, which was the biggest change they had seen. There's been probably 30 drugs run through refractory chronic cough, all of which have failed except camlipixant, Bellus's drug, which was acquired by GSK. So there's been a lot of data generated here. This was the biggest results of any of these trials. The other important thing, the P2X3s, the way they've been able to have success, or at least the camlipixant, is they started enriching for the highest cough counters. And that's just a math thing because this is a mean change on a cough count. And they're only hitting one peripheral receptor. They have to have high enough count that when someone gets triggered through that receptor, they're getting a big response to sort of overwhelm all the other triggers that aren't working. And so there'd been sort of this lore that built up in kind of moderate coughers, drugs weren't working. The problem is in the world today, the pulmonologists and patients don't think of it as moderate or severe cough because they don't walk around in cough counters. They have no idea if they cough 18 times an hour or 21 times an hour. So it's sort of artificial. So in this trial, we actually stratified and looked at those two buckets of cough and saw no difference. So we saw a big effect across all cough counts. Actually, in this trial, we measured this at the 1 week mark, and the full effect was there by 1 week. So came on very quickly. This one guy referenced earlier, he had a 90% reduction in his cough by that first week, which is pretty impressive, and 87% responder rate. So again, I would say equally as strong data in refractory chronic cough as what we just talked about in IPF.
Right. Do you see delineating between severe and moderate chronic cough in future studies for refractory chronic cough, or are you done saying it's the same?
Fortunately, we're done with that topic. It doesn't, that's not how patients think about it. It's not how doctors think about it. And it appears we don't need to do that to run a successful trial. So no, we'll have some minimal level of cough because clearly our drug isn't appropriate for mild intermittent cough. We're really going after that moderate to severe cougher. So we'll make sure there's some baseline cough count, probably around 10 per hour. But once you're beyond that, we're not going to try to delineate people much beyond that.
And you did mention GSK's P2X3 antagonist that they acquired, and it is ahead of you. I think it's in phase 3.
Yeah.
In your mind, is there a legitimate comparison in the efficacy, considering that they are only considering severe cough patients? How do you think you stack up?
Yeah, so first of all, there's about 2 to 3 million refractory chronic cough patients in the US. So it is a big population. There's a lot of unmet need. And to the point you were raising, because they have to run their trials really focused on the most severe coughers, that's only about a third of the market. And they only work in about 60% of those patients. So, they're really only able to treat about, call it 15 to 20% of the overall patient population. So, I think there's plenty of unmet need here for patients where P2X3 antagonists won't work, that'll, now have access to another mechanism.
Yeah, we talked a lot about refractory chronic cough and understanding the difference between a productive cough and a non-productive cough. It seems pretty heterogeneous.
Yeah.
And when you take that into consideration in the patients you enroll, how do you make sure that you're enriching for the patients more likely to respond to Haduvio? And I don't know if you can answer this question. Did the phase 2 provide any insights in patients who are more likely to be responders?
Yeah, so the only enrichment I would say we do is that minimum cough count, because it's hard to show a big change if you're not coughing that much. So that's really the only sort of minimum criteria. Beyond that, I mentioned to you, we had 87% of the subjects in this trial have a clinically meaningful response. So I think because of this central mechanism, if you have neurological cough, our drug will treat that. So we haven't had to try to parse among patients. So there's some carve outs for safety. You have to have certain, in the IPF trial, certain minimum oxygen levels that you have. We carve out people who are on certain drugs, but those are more safety parameters. There's no enriching of patients that we have to do other than just a minimum level of cough.
Okay, that's great. Quickly on market opportunity, you mentioned 2 to 3 million in refractory chronic cough, but I think the prevalence is much higher than that. You're probably focusing on a certain diagnosed patient population. Could you talk about the wider market? And with an approved therapy out there, I imagine there's opportunity to expand on that population, and also the market for IPF chronic cough.
Yeah. So let's zoom out just on our commercial strategy. Our lead indication will be IPF cough. So that'll lead our commercial strategy. That has about 150,000 patients. About 85% of them cough, and about 60 to 70% have refractory cough where nothing else works for them. So that's our patient market. Fortunately, in that space, pricing has been very high. These antifibrotics are priced at $130,000, $140,000 a year. It's a small category. It's largely unmanaged. And the price research we've done has said it's pretty inelastic around pricing. So that will lead the way for us on pricing and just overall commercial strategy. The second pillar is actually IPF is sort of half of the interstitial lung disease market. In the other half of other interstitial lung diseases, there's a lot of cough as well. So that sort of doubles the opportunity, similar kind of payer dynamic. So you can take the IPF bucket, if you will. We'll be able to double it with ILDs. You can sort of play around with the math, but these easily get to $1 to $2 billion in each of these markets. So then that's important as you roll into refractory chronic cough, because we're not trying to be the be-all, end-all solution across that entire big, broad population, because that would create payer problems for us, nor do we think our drug is appropriate there. So we think about our drug being used in the most refractory patients where nothing else works. So you can go through and fail, all the stuff they're using now, quite frankly, they probably failed. They use things like codeine cough syrup, Tessalon pearls, gabapentin, none of these things work. The P2X3 is approved, fine, work your way through that. But then you come to a point where there's nothing that works for you. You can get our product and it might require some step throughs around prior auth, but you're going to pay what the pricing is in IPF. We're not going to lower our pricing to access that bigger market. And so you don't need to pick up very many RCC patients for that to also become north of $1 billion opportunity pretty quickly.
Wow, that's a pretty interesting approach. I think we're getting close to time, so I definitely look forward to seeing your progress, and this has been an incredibly exciting time for you guys. So thank you for joining us on our podcast. I'm going to pass it back to Tim. He may have an additional question for you and to just wrap up.
Thank you, Doe.
Thanks, Doe. Yeah, I just have a couple of questions to wrap up here, Jennifer. So out of curiosity, what are the next steps for Haduvio and IPF cough and refractory chronic cough?
Yeah, so now we get a pivot and hustle. So the next key is checking in with the FDA. So we'll request our end of phase 2 meeting to agree on our pivotal program for IPF. That's an important meeting for us. We'll also start up on the refractory chronic cough. We'll do a phase 2B dose ranging study. So that's being planned now. And finally, I mentioned this other interstitial lung diseases. We've got a protocol written to start a phase 2 study there and hopefully tie these two together and show there's nothing different. So by the first half of next year, hopefully we've started all those clinical studies and be progressing towards the next data set.
Great. And then to wrap it up, unrelated, but I know it's important to investors to know the answer. I appreciate that the company recently completed a financing. Can you tell us what kind of runway that gives the company?
Yeah, also important to biotech CEOs. So an important question. Yeah, we just raised a little over $100 million. I should mention that offering was 4 times oversubscribed. So a lot of interest in cough for sure. That will take us into 2029. So that funds our entire pivotal program for IPF. So we'll get to data on both trials and also the long-term extension data. It'll fund the 2B and refractory chronic cough, and it'll fund the phase 2 and ILD and provides an additional 1 year of runway beyond that. So we're sitting in a really good place. It's a very capital efficient model because it's one drug across 3 indications. And the other 2 I mentioned are SNDA. So they only require a single pivotal study. So we can cover a lot of ground with $100 million.
That's truly a remarkable stat, what you just said about 4x oversubscribed. As an investor myself and former sell-side analyst, that got my attention. So,
yeah.
Jennifer, I'm going to actually have this last part cut out. I just need to ask you, did I properly call it Trevi or is it Trevi?
No, you were right, Trevi.
Okay, cool. Okay.
After the Trevi fountain.
So we'll be cutting this out, and I'm going to pretend we didn't ask that.
Okay,
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today, Jennifer Good, CEO of Trevi Therapeutics, NASDAQ ticker symbol TRVI. And thanks to my equity research colleague, Doe Kim, for also joining us today. Finally, a special thanks to the producer and the editor of the podcast, Joe Brunetto. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research, podcasts, fireside chats, and conference schedules. We will see you next time for another edition of the WTR Biotech Spotlight podcast.